Welcome to the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation's Grantee Spotlight, a space where we highlight the powerful insights of our amazing grantees to accelerate our collective impact. I'm Rumeli Banik, Senior Program Officer for Child Wellbeing at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The Child Wellbeing Program aims to promote children's healthy development and protect them from abuse and neglect. Our grant making takes a family-centered public health approach to support more equitable outcomes for children and families and thriving communities. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Sixto Cancel, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Think of Us, a nonprofit organization we support to promote systems change for foster care. May is National Foster Care Month, and so we cannot think of a more appropriate guest to have us to join us than Sixto. Sixto and his organization, Think of Us, have been leading the way in transforming the child welfare system so that those who have experienced the system firsthand are involved in the design, imagining, and building of solutions. Sixto, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Rumeli, I'm super excited to be here and super excited to have this conversation.
Welcome. Sixto, you've described Think of Us as a research and development lab that grew out of a technology nonprofit. Can you take us on the journey of how you grew to an organization and explain why you decided to take this more unconventional structural approach?
Absolutely. I guess the journey begins back when I was a teenager in foster care. So I had entered as an 11-month-old baby, but then was adopted at the age of 9. And it was a very abusive and racist adoption. And so at 13, I found myself couch surfing and homeless. And it took me having to literally tape a recorder to my chest to record the abuse and to get back into the system at 15. That's when I fell in love with how do you change the system itself. And so I started the first version of Think of Us, when I say Think of Us 1.0, was to have an app, right, that would allow young people like me who were in bad situations, whether it be in care or trying to get back into care, to have a voice in their case plan, to be able to interact with the system. And that way that young people would be able to kind of do that self-advocacy. As we start to roll out and build technology, what we realized is that the problem was so much bigger than just an app, right? Then it wasn't just a technology issue. It was a systems design issue. It's that the architecture of our actual system was flawed. And when we apply technology to a broken process, we only get to our broken result faster. And so that's when we revamped to Think of Us 2.0, where we looked at how do we become a systems change organization? How do we build a nonprofit that leverages lived experience, data, and insights and redesign different pieces of the system so that we can create proof points for why we should change the fundamental architect of the system?
Thanks, Sixto. Your comments about systems change are so important. This year's Foster Care Month campaign focuses on strengthening relative and kin connections and the positive impact these relationships have on maintaining family and cultural ties for children and youth in foster care. Sixto, your moving and very personal guest essay in the New York Times entitled Our Foster Care System is Broken covered the importance of this terrain in great detail. Can you speak to why these connections should be maintained?
I mean, I guess there's like two ways to answer this. I mean, from the standpoint of the system, like when young people are placed with kin, the research is clear. They fare better, right? They have less moves. They're emotionally more attached to folks. But fundamentally, I think the larger conversation is that we made a promise when we removed young people from their initial home. And we said that something about your future, about your current safety was at risk. And the purpose of foster care was to come in and do a temporary, removal, and then to figure out how you get reunited. And if you can't get reunited, how might you be connected to forever lasting connections, right? And so the importance of these connections are one where we continue to actually promote family for young people. Today, only 33% of young people actually live with a biological family member or someone that they know. And it doesn't actually have to be that way. And that when young people are with bio family, that we know their life outcomes are better than when they are being raised in sometimes what folks would call stranger foster care.
And to really drive this point home, what needs to change in the child welfare system to ensure that this happens whenever possible?
Number one, it's the mental model. I cannot tell you how many conversations that we're in where people will say, well, if we removed from one family member, what makes the next family member different? And so there is a perception around family, this idea that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, which is a big misconception. The second thing is that we're putting biological family, we're taking grandma, uncle, aunt through a process that is similar to foster parent licensing. And there are many things that could be waived in that process, and that states do have that authority to be able to do that. And so how might we actually make it easier for grandma to raise her hand? And then what's so disturbing to me is like the story of like Miss Polk out of Texas, where, 6 of her grandchildren were removed from her care, and from her daughter's care. And she took in those 6 children and she didn't have the financial support, but yet the system was like, hey, you need an extra bedroom. Yet the system was like, you need the extra car seat. You need to get a bigger car. And even though she twisted and turned to make ends meet, she got a friend to help bring the children to school. She figured out all these things. At one point, the system removed them all and placed them with the foster parent, all 6. And that was about $10,000 a month that the system was willing to pay a stranger. But yet we didn't provide anything for grandma. Eventually, 3 of the young people were placed back with grandma. But we're living in a country where we're not resourcing biological families and we're not supporting them with the same supports that we would give someone who raises their hand to support these children.
That's such an important example of how our foster care system is broken. Your essay also illuminated how your personal experience with the foster care system informed your perspectives on what youth in the system need. Why is it so critical that those with lived experience are centered in work to strengthen or reform foster care?
One of the things that I feel like we do as a system is that we're always solving to the wrong problem, or we think we're solving to the right problem. But the reality is that in order to solve such a complex issue is that we have to be able to solve to the nuances of these issues. And when we engage people with lived experience, that is what's brought to the table, the missing information, the lived experience data, as I like to call it. Lived experience data, lived experience insights. It's so that we can truly dig in and understand what is that one small thing that we actually have to really solve towards. I'll give you the example of talking about, licensing and in one state where 30% of the folks were failing because folks didn't realize that they needed a fire extinguisher, right? And so the fire department would come out and then they would turn around and fail that, fail that test. And then the fire department had to make a new appointment 2 months later. And so you had young people talking about, hey, I thought I was gonna go live with grandma, but this last piece didn't go through because there wasn't a fire ladder, or there wasn't this, or there wasn't a cabinet with a lock for the knives and the medication. And so by actually talking to young people, talking to folks about what their experience are, we get to understand how can we solve that. And when they the simple fix of that problem in that state was that they literally started to send out a checklist, and they literally started to carry fire extinguishers when the inspection was happening. And if you didn't have one, you would get one. And that boosted the number of people being licensed by 30%.
And that's such an example of how other states and other jurisdictions can really learn from what the experiences of families and youth are. So along the lines of the same question, how does Think of Us embed centering the lived experience and centering the voices of youth as an organizational practice?
Yeah, so we look at integrating the integration of lived experience and through all of our work. I think it's one thing to engage. And I've been part of so many initiatives that were about the engagement, but I think we've reached a new era in the youth engagement movement where it's now about youth integration. It's now about biofamily integration. It's now about kin, integration. How do at every single point of the process that we're not just soliciting information from folks and then making decisions about them, but that we actually have team members who have lived experience expertise, right? We actually turn around and be able to say, you know what, let me ask a bunch of folks with lived experience in the thousands and the tens of thousands, solicit that type of data back, and then let it be synthesized with a variety of different subject matter experts, some of which are people with lived experience, to be able to draw out the insights and then be able to design. And so for us at the organization, from the inception of a project to scoping it, to being able to the execution of it, we're integrating lived experience at every single point of the project.
So great transition into my next question. Think of us recently officially launched the Center for Lived Experience. Congratulations. Can you share more about why you developed the Center for Lived Experience and how you approach the strategic planning for it?
Absolutely. So we decided to launch a Center for Lived Experience. And the Center for Lived Experience is about how do we actually really codify the sourcing of data from leveraging technology to source data from tens of thousands of people with lived experience to inform systems reform. And we look at three particular categories: participatory research and data. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is community building. And then pillar number three is proximate policy. And what we saw that was missing, or we felt that we could add value to the ecosystem, was how do we really start to understand the deep nuances of the problems that have been known to us for so long. As we start to dig in, we realized that there were a couple of nuggets that if we crack those things, we would learn a little bit more. Secondly, we know that people all across the country want to integrate lived experience, not just in advocacy, but in software development, in program development, in emergency aid, you name it. And so the demand for integrating lived experience across the spectrum of services and resources has skyrocketed. And so how do we help the community build a bit of that capacity? And then today, every single day, people at the federal ecosystem, Congress, White House, and the federal agencies are making decisions that are changing people's lives. And sometimes those decisions makes it easier to operate. Sometimes those decisions make it a little bit tougher to operate. And what those folks are asking for is insights, data from people with actual lived experience on the ground to be able to go ahead and make decisions so that they can do things that what they feel constitutes a federal intervention.
What do you envision the Center for Lived Experience will look like in a few years' time? And what do you hope to accomplish?
So when I think about a few years' time, what I'm hoping is yes, that we will have reports. Yes, that we will be able to have been part of, some regulatory changes, some laws being passed. But most importantly, what I'm super encouraged about and what I hope that we can do is that in the community building aspect, that people will take our methodologies and they'll start to run. And that we won't be the only one with the technical capacity to be able to do this type of work, and that people will adopt that and run 1,000 miles. I haven't listened to a lot of Tupac's music, but I saw this one clip on Instagram and he was like, my job is not to be the greatest, or I don't seek to be the greatest, but it's to inspire the next greatest mind. And I think that when we think about organizations, and the nonprofit complex, we sometimes are having to center our org as the person who does this niche. But true exponential impact comes when the ecosystem itself has now, which was once your niche as an org, but it exists in so many different places. And at the end of the day, foster care and child welfare is how the Constitution holds that responsibility with the states. And some states bring it down to the county level. So 58 different systems in the state of California, 122 different systems in the state of Virginia. So what we need is local folks to be able to take these methodologies, take this way of thinking, and run 1,000 miles towards the things that are going to work for their community. So what I'm hoping is that in a few years from now, and maybe more than just a few years, but that we will go ahead and be in a situation where the center is not the only one doing some of the work that it's doing today.
Wow, and I really want to lift up your openness, your collaborative spirit, and the recognition that we all really need to work together to solve these issues. And so you started talking about this a bit, but if you could talk a bit more about how practitioners working at large, and sometimes in slow-moving and bureaucratic systems, how do these organizations advocate for the inclusion of those who have lived experience with these systems?
Well, I think that it's very interesting because different bureaucracies are at different places. And so some bureaucracies are in a place where they're starting to be able to hear, but yet on a journey to figure out what do you do with the information. And the one thing about lived experience data, lived experience insights, is that when we ask people to share their narrative, and when we ask them and we bring them forward, I think one of the most important things is to understand what is the actual type of data that you need to be able to hear. How do you prep this person to be able to provide that nuance? Because I believe we should be sharing kind of experiences versus your full story. Because it's in the experience where you think through what's the workflow that needs to change in the systems process to be able to take value out of that story and it be worth asking a person to go back to some of the most painful moments of their life for our benefits of understanding how we should operate differently. And so I think some systems are in a place where they're still in the extractive mode. Some systems are starting to lean towards how do you actually share power with young people. We look at LA County, there's an official youth commission, and that youth commission is literally having public meetings about what needs to change, what needs to be reformed. And that's a whole new way of operating.
What can other organizations in the social sector do to adapt some of the lessons into their work?
I honestly believe that, centering lived experience is an actual mindset. It's not, so there are tools, yes, and there are practices. But when people talk about, well, for example, we did a report called Away from Home that looked at the experiences of young people in congregate care settings. And in the selection process, we had put out this form. We had 276 young people within 24 hours apply to be part of it. And we could only accept about 78 folks to participate. And one of the things that we did when we said, okay, we made our selection is that we made a video, it's about 10 minutes long, and we walked through how we did the selection and what academia required in this pre-screening. And we walked that through and we called it a transparency memo, and then we sent it to everyone who had applied. And folks were like, oh, where did you learn to practice? And it's not that you learn that practice. It's that if you're thinking about every person that you interact with, then you're thinking about the experience of those who were selected. You're thinking about the experiences of those who weren't selected. And how do you show up for people and how they might feel when they're not selected? And so that's where we get a lot of our practices. It's just from having the mindset of what is literally the experience people are going to have when they're engaging and on all of the different tracks.
And that makes me think about how, exactly for our systems, for our organizations to really be person-centric and to say what is going to be the experience of that person that's seeing this video or experiencing whatever is happening here. What about philanthropy? What do you consider to be philanthropy's role in supporting your work and the child welfare sector as a whole?
Yeah, I think philanthropy has a major part to play in being able to help organizations build up the infrastructure. The reality is that when you are working with people, especially folks who have experienced trauma, there's the professional development that needs to be there for those folks, but there's also the wraparound support sometimes where you need to refer someone to services. And so I think we are making big strides in the sector around compensating and honoring young people's time with being able to do that. But we also need the ability to be able to say, okay, which staff person or which entity are we going to be partnering with to make sure that we can do the appropriate referrals when stuff hits the fan? If we are doing our work right, then we're not just engaging the young person who is stably housed, that is completely enrolled in school and is and is on a track where they're self-actualizing the life that they want to live. We would be engaging the spectrum of people who are experiencing multiple levels of success and multiple levels of challenges.
How can systems serving youth in foster care better coordinate to center the best interests of these youth?
One of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about coordination, right? I think the reality is that people live in the people who are working in the system are living under an urgency. Commissioners come in, directors come in. The average director, from my understanding, is about 18 months in their role. And so there's always this kind of starting and restarting and restarting and restarting. And so when I think about the coordination and I think about these pieces, one of the things that's become clear to me is that it needs to be embodied by the multiple levels. And what we sometimes see is that one director will be like, hey, I'm really all about youth voice, and maybe a little bit about bio parents voice, right? And like super into kin voice, you know? And so like, depending on sometimes leadership, you get this kind of, you know, kind of combination of like what folks are interested in. But I think what needs to happen is fundamentally and structurally, we have to figure out a way that no matter what leadership's opinion is or or what inspires them, that we are baking into the actual process, that we can't move to the next step without having had integrated lived experience data, lived experience insights.
Mm-hmm. And so the next couple of questions, I'm just going to ask them together, but and some of this you've already been speaking to. So as a integrated response to these questions, how can the sector better inform policymaking that serves these children and families? And what about the data? You've been talking about data a lot, but how can data that's inclusive of lived experience also better inform policymaking? And why is policymaking such a crucial piece to the puzzle?
Absolutely. So when I think about data and policymaking, you know, the presence of people with lived experience is not enough to say that you've adequately sourced enough data to make great policy, right? As we know, data can skew left, skew right, and it's the process of saying, okay, what type of feedback, by whom, how inclusive are we being? How do we make sure that that the data goes from just being data collection to actually evidence and inference of why we should actually do something the way we do, right? And so there's a process in that. And so when I think about policy making, I think that one, we need to be able to be very conscious about how do we go from lived experience data to the evidence making that then say, here's the, you know, federal or state, you know, what constitutes a federal state intervention to change something. And the reason why policy is so important is because literally policy is what's ruling our lives. I think during the pandemic, more people than ever realized how much of an influence that government can have on your daily life. And that was during an emergency health crisis that the world went through together. When it comes down to foster care and it comes down to living in the system, whether you get a vaccine or not goes to the Capitol, right? Or that was my experience, at least. You know, when I needed a calculator for my math class in the 8th grade and it was more than $100, it was a bureaucratic process. You know, when my brother unfortunately passed away, the paperwork wasn't done so that I can get to the funeral, right? Because it was cross party lines. Policy literally dictates the life of a young person in care like there's no tomorrow. And so we need to be looking at policy because it is the guide rails by which organizations and agencies are taking action on. And those are the things that are changing people's trajectory of life.
And the examples that you're giving really speak to both the quantitative and the qualitative data, the stories, the experiences that youth have, that people have, that policymakers need to listen to and need to have access to be able to inform their policymaking decisions. And so if there's one lesson you want nonprofits, policymakers, and funders to walk away from this conversation with, what might that be?
I guess the one lesson I would say is that, you know, I look at engaging people who have experiences in foster care or experiences having their children removed or experiences taking in a relative, that I look at that and I say, you know, each and every one of those stories is a data point. and there's different type of data points. And as we go on systems change initiatives and we look to change the system, we have to start treating those data points just as valuable as other data points, number one. Number two, that there are different types of data, right, sets to solve different type of problems. And that is the same thing with people's stories. And the way that I would encourage everybody to lean in is to start thinking about these things as lived experience data, lived experience insights, and that there are sub types of data in that. And that we should always be thinking about what is the exact type of data that we need in order to solve this problem. And that will get us closer to the nuances of an issue, of a problem, so that then we can be effective problem solvers.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Sixto. We are honored to support Think of Us as you lead the way in transforming the child welfare system, and we appreciate your generosity with your knowledge and important perspectives for how we can improve the system by centering the voices and the data of the children and families at the heart of it.
Thank you.